The Mountain Man's Bride. Hunger has a way of outweighing courage, and in that particular town, keeping up appearances mattered far more than showing any real kindness. At least, until the sound of a mountain man's boots came echoing across the wooden boardwalk. Elias never once asked about her history or the so-called flaws people whispered about. Without hesitation, he set a heavy pouch of coins down on the counter. The auctioneer blinked, clearly caught off guard that anyone would step forward with such an offer. A wave of gasps rolled through the gathered crowd, the way wind sweeps through dry grass on a hot afternoon. He climbed right up onto the platform without waiting for anyone's permission. His rough, weathered hands reached out slowly toward the trembling sack. For a brief moment, even the horses seemed to go still and hold their breath. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost reach out and grab it, like a storm rolling in off the mountains. Then, in one smooth and deliberate motion, he pulled the sack free. And that was the moment his entire world shifted right beneath his boots. Her face was nothing like the rumors had painted it. Not monstrous, not cursed, not the frightening thing people had whispered about. A pale scar traced its way gently along her jaw, like a faded strike of lightning left behind long ago. One eye shimmered a soft, quiet gray, while the other held the deep, rich green of an old forest. In her expression, there was fear, yes, but underneath it, something like quiet, unbroken defiance. She looked up at him the way someone does when they're braced for the same cruelty they've already seen too many times. Instead, the only reason Elias stepped back was pure, unexpected astonishment. Not from anything ugly, but from a beauty so striking it nearly knocked the air from his chest. It was the kind of beauty you only catch when you're actually paying attention, the kind that speaks of survival rather than vanishing youth. And just like that, the crowd's laughter suddenly sounded hollow and small. He cleared his throat, pulling himself together against the storm rising in his chest. "She's coming with me," he said, his voice steady and low, leaving no room for argument. Nobody pushed back, because the money on that counter had already made the decision for them. The bride stepped down from the platform, her footing uncertain, but her chin held level. Elias took the worn leather coat from his own shoulders and offered it against the mountain cold. She paused, then accepted it, her fingers trembling as she reached out. You can picture the whispers trailing behind them down the street. People always seem to find the most to say when they don't understand what courage looks like. But neither of them so much as glanced back. The mountains were calling, and together, the two of them answered. The climb was long, and for a good stretch, utterly silent. Snow still clung to the shadowed patches of the trail, stubborn against the warming season. She was the first to speak, her voice barely more than the sound of ash settling. "My name is Clara," she said, just above a whisper. He gave a single quiet nod and offered his own name in return. There were no grand declarations, no hasty vows made on that mountain path, just two strangers making their way up toward whatever came next. And you and I both know that trust doesn't grow fast. It takes its time, like a pine tree finding its way through rocky ground. Yet something tender and fragile began taking shape with every careful step they shared. Maybe it was the kind of understanding that only grows between people who know what real loneliness feels like. When they finally reached the cabin, a thin curl of smoke was already drifting from the chimney. Inside, the place was simple, but kept with a quiet kind of pride. A single window looked out onto an endless stretch of mountains, all dusted in the gold of the evening sun. Clara set the coat aside and stood awkwardly near the door, unsure where to put herself. Elias turned his attention to the fire, giving himself something to do while his racing thoughts settled. He hadn't planned for marriage, hadn't planned for any kind of company at all, really. But he couldn't push aside the fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness already rising inside him. Clara, meanwhile, took in every corner of the room, quietly measuring the shape of her new life. Neither of them brought up the town again. Some chapters are better left behind, not reread. The days that followed tested them both in equal measure. Clara set to learning how to split wood, even as her hands blistered and her muscles protested. Elias showed her which berries were safe to eat and which ones would make you regret it. They shared quiet meals of stew by lantern light, and slowly, carefully, laughter began finding its way into the cabin. He found out that she could spend hours just listening to the wind move through the pines. She discovered that he hummed quietly, almost without realizing it, while mending his traps. Those small things, the little details, slowly stitched their lives together. The scar along her jaw became simply a part of her story, nothing more. Her mismatched eyes, one gray and one green, seemed to reflect the wilderness around them as though they belonged to it. Then one evening, a storm came rolling over the peaks without much warning. Thunder crashed against the cabin walls, hard enough to rattle them, like cannon fire echoing off stone. Clara flinched with every sharp crack splitting the sky. Without really thinking about it, Elias reached over and placed his steady hand on top of hers. It was the first time he'd touched her on purpose. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers closed around his while the rain hammered at the roof above them. In that small, fragile moment, something unspoken settled between them. Not ownership, not obligation, but a real and honest partnership. And sometimes, if you think about it, that's far rarer and more valuable than love alone. A few weeks later, a man from town made his way up the mountain path. One of those people whose curiosity is really just nosiness wearing a polite coat. He came with news wrapped in skepticism, wondering aloud whether Elias had any regrets about his strange purchase. His eyes kept drifting rudely to the scar on Clara's jaw. Elias stepped forward before the man could let those eyes do any more damage. "She is my wife," he said plainly, in a tone that dared anyone to say otherwise. Beside him, Clara stood taller than she had in a long time. The man from town left, carrying considerably more respect than he'd brought up the mountain with him. Word would make its way back down, but the story would be told differently this time. That's the thing about courage. When it rewrites a story, the ending changes completely. As the seasons turned, Clara slowly made the cabin her own. Wildflowers started appearing in jars along the windowsill. Warm quilts softened the once bare wooden bed. Elias found himself staying indoors more often than he ever used to. He listened to her stories about growing up along riverbanks. She listened to his accounts of blizzards he'd survived alone on the mountain. They were no longer two strangers joined by a transaction. They were two people who chose each other, again and again, every single day. And that kind of choice means more than any ceremony ever could. Even the mountains, in their quiet way, seemed to approve. One afternoon, the two of them walked into town together, unannounced. The whispers started up again, but this time they were driven by curiosity rather than cruelty. Clara walked confidently at her husband's side, no sack over her face, no shadow over her presence. The afternoon light caught her mismatched eyes and made them glint like two different gemstones. The children who watched her stared not out of fear, but out of fascination. The same rancher who had once passed on her stood watching from a distance, and something that looked a lot like regret crossed his weathered face. Elias noticed, but he offered no smirk, no pointed look. Some victories speak for themselves through quiet dignity alone. Clara's steady, unhurried smile said everything that needed saying. Standing there in the middle of that street, she understood something she hadn't before. She had never truly been unwanted. She had only ever been misread and mistreated by people who didn't bother to look past the surface. The sack hadn't been hiding anything monstrous. It had only ever been concealing other people's shallow judgment. When Elias had pulled it free and stepped back, it wasn't from horror. It was from a kind of awakening. He saw strength where everyone else saw imperfection. He saw resilience, shaped by hardship, not broken by it. And in truly seeing her, he changed the direction of her life entirely. Though perhaps, when you look at it honestly, he changed his own life even more. Because love that grows from genuine compassion puts down roots that go deep and hold firm, no matter the season. The mountains have always known that truth, and they don't need anyone's applause to stand by it. So the next time you find yourself hearing stories of brides sold and strange bargains struck, let this one come to mind. Not every purchase means possession, and not every scar carries shame. Sometimes the loneliest man on the mountain turns out to be the bravest soul in the whole valley. And sometimes the woman everyone turned away from becomes the strongest person in it.